Mohamed, I want to go right to the negatives, and that it appears that Mr. Biden is doing better than Secretary Clinton did. Is it because he's less least liked than Hillary Clinton was less least liked?
That's a great question. Favorability is absolutely critical. What we find this year is that with likely voters, Biden has a 52% favorability rating. Secretary Clinton, at the same moment with those same demographic likely voters, was at 43%. So he beats her just by 9 points there. Compared to President Trump, he's at 43% favorability with likely voters. That's a slight improvement from where we were in 2016 with President Trump, where he only had a 39% favorability rating. But Tom, you nailed it. As we move into these cycles, really since President Obama, we are now facing a series of elections where candidates tend to have a lower favorability rating than they did in generations past,
Right.
where favorability ratings tended to be very high. The other really interesting statistic just on that point
Please.
is that when you ask Democrats who plan to vote for Biden, whether they're voting for President Biden or voting so that President Trump is removed from power, that breaks down to about a 52 to 48 breakdown. People voting for Biden that support him versus people that want to see the president removed. That's common, though, because when an incumbent is in office, it's always about whether or not you want the incumbent to continue.
The gentleman from Iowa, the late George Gallup, I'm sure would roll over in his grave if he looked at Real Clear Politics or any of the other compendiums of what he wrought. Mohamed, you've got to look at it as well. One of the salient things here is Gallup has walked away from doing battleground state polling. Why have you walked away from that? Is it because you can't trust the polls in the individual state races?
That's such a great question, Tom. Actually, Dr. Gallup's obsession with presidential predictions for the elections was simply an attempt to get people to focus on whether or not his sampling methods were accurate. And he said this later in his life, that it was really sort of a public experiment, a dichotomous outcome where people cared. His real passion was that leaders could make better decisions if they have accurate, reliable data and know what their people are thinking. We continue to be committed to the gold standard. We haven't done state polls in quite a while. It is very challenging to replicate two polls in the same state just because the sampling is really tough to do. That being said, we continue to poll on a national level, and we've seen some record-breaking numbers in this cycle compared going all the way back to the 60s and even 50s. So, for example, enthusiasm is very high this year. When you ask Americans whether or not they're more or less enthusiastic for this election than others, 69% of Americans overall say they are very enthusiastic to participate in this election. We haven't seen that number really since 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president. When you look at Republicans and Democrats on that, there's a 9-point difference between Democrats, 75% enthusiasm, and Republicans at 66%. So there's a 9-point gap. It's interesting, though, to note that in 2008, that gap, now 9 points in favor of Democrats, was actually 15 points in favor of Democrats. So we don't see the gap that we saw just before President Obama was elected, but certainly a gap in enthusiasm. The other thing that is really unique this time is asking whether or not people are fearful about the election outcome if their candidate doesn't win. Today in America, 64% of registered voters say they're fearful about the outcome if their candidate doesn't win. Republicans, Democrats, basically the same, but that's a rate higher than we've seen in the past.
Mohamed, what do you mean by the outcome? They're worried about social unrest, or they're worried about policies being put in place by the team that they don't support?
So essentially, they're worried about what will happen in the country if their candidate is not elected president. I think this gets to a lot of the talk about unrest after the election, concern about the finality of the outcome. We see a significant level of apprehension among Americans about this outcome. We haven't seen this metric in the 60s really ever. In 1996, 35% of Americans had that same level of concern. Today, it's 64%. And it is bipartisan. We also know that the most important topic on the minds of Americans going into this election is COVID. The president gets a 40% approval rating on how he's handled the crisis. His approval rating overall is 46%. Usually an incumbent wants to be closer to that 50% mark. This will be a really interesting election because it will truly test whether or not somebody right there in the mid-40s can win re-election, because we have not seen that historically in the past.
Mohamed, talk to me about the 93 million votes that have already happened, the early voting, which I think is about 65 or 67% of the total votes in 2016. Do you have any insight into what those early votes are?
Absolutely. So you can actually track. Some states allow a reporting of whether or not the vote was from a registered Democrat or Republican. So in those states, you can see. One thing that's really interesting is that we did see a very strong Democrat-leaning interest to vote earlier on in the cycle. That's actually waned a little bit. Republicans have become more involved in the early voting process, at least according to our polls. So we really see sort of an evening out there. The key with the vote, of course, is Americans are voting differently than they ever have in the past in this election. That only raises the apprehension, as in your previous segment, of how quickly these votes can really be counted. In some states, they can't be counted until tomorrow. But we are definitely seeing the votes in terms of volume coming in early, matching up really with our traditional metric, which is the thought given to the election. When we see people's thought given to the election being higher, historically, we've seen a higher turnout in vote.
Mohamed, over the weekend, any number of ways to cut this. I thought the coverage, folks, from everyone, including Bloomberg, was just superb. Mohamed, over the weekend, really a focus on the Latino vote. What does a Gallup take on it with the Latino mood, the character, the distinction here versus 4 years ago?
Well, President Trump has really, and the Republican Party have really made a big deal about the Latino vote. A lot of claims that Latinos were sort of warming to the Republican Party, the GOP. We've tested that several times in the past few months with our approval rating. We haven't seen that necessarily. The Latino vote is one of the most diverse, of course, in the United States. It's one of the most difficult to make generalizations about. It looks very different in Florida than, for example, where I grew up in Southern California and Los Angeles. I think ultimately it is, again, going to be about turnout. The appointment of the Supreme Court justice, of course, was a really important move for the Catholic vote, as many GOP analysts have pointed out. It doesn't seem that that's become sort of a major issue on the minds of folks going to vote, because there's just so much more happening in the economy, in the country, and in politics. So I would shy away from making any kind of presumptions about where the Latino vote will be. I think it'll be a state-by-state reality.